I have just over 200 books on my physical TBR, all stored on this one bookshelf, and they stare at me every day, reminding me that I have not yet read them, despite the fact that I purchased them, spent my hard-earned money on them, and am storing them in my house. So I started this challenge, my Read It or Unhaul It challenge, in July of 2025 so that I could spin a wheel to randomly pick a book so I wouldn't have to encumber my few remaining brain cells to try to make a decision, and read those books and review them for you, or DNF them and unhaul them. And it went pretty well in 2025. In 2026, I revamped the rules just a bit, mostly in reducing it to an every other week instead of every week pace to give myself a little bit more breathing room, and introducing a points system. So I'll link the video where I explain that if you're interested. And I'll also link the last reading vlog where I review the first 4 books that I read for this challenge in 2026, and also my first DNF for this challenge ever. So check out the last reading vlog if you missed it. But I want to get this video started, so let's spin the wheel and find out what I'm going to read first for this reading vlog. Let's spin the wheel and find out what we're reading next. I'm excited. I've had so many 5-star reads recently. The Trial. Oh, The Trial by Kafka. Ooh, how exciting. Okay, wait. Well, I'm super excited to read The Trial by Kafka next. I have not actually read any of Kafka's work. I have this plus 3 more of his books on my shelves backwards there. Now there's a weird gap. And I was originally thinking of doing a reading vlog, trying Kafka for the first time and reading 4 of his works, but I kept putting it off in part because I thought maybe it was a little niche and I didn't know how many people would actually want to watch that, but also because I thought maybe it would be a bit much for me and I didn't want to sort of pressure myself to read a bunch of his works all at once. I kind of wanted to be able to take my time a little more. So I'm excited. I feel like this made the decision for me. I can now read this over the next 2 weeks and take my time and read the rest as wanted, as needed. If you would want a video specifically about Kafka or reading several of his works, I could read the other 3 in a reading vlog. So there's still possibilities. Let me know in the comments, but I am very excited to read this one. I cannot wait. So I'm going to go start it and I'll be back when I get to the halfway point. It's under 200 pages, so not too much, but I'll be back to let you know my initial thoughts when I get there. So I'm halfway through The Trial. I don't know that I can say that much, to be honest, until I finish it. It's not that long of a book, and it's pretty strange so far. And I have some ideas about what Kafka is trying to do, but I really feel like this is the kind of book where I probably have to absorb the entire thing and then reflect on it for a bit to really formulate an opinion. I'm doing what I usually try to do with classics, which is read them on my own without any outside input to see how I react to them and what I pick up on and what I feel it's trying to do. And then after I have formed my own opinion, I look up what scholars say about the work and what some of the common interpretations are and so on, and compare those to how I interpreted the work on my own. And I'm doing that again here. I haven't looked up any outside information about this book and what it's doing. All I did was read the introduction, which didn't have any spoilers for the story itself, just talked about what was going on in Kafka's own life at the time that he wrote this. But, you know, it's weird so far. Joseph wakes up and there are some random men he's never seen before in his apartment, and they're telling him that he is under arrest, but they won't tell him why. They say they don't even know why. That's not up to them. It doesn't bother them. And he continues to meet more people in relation to this apparent arrest and trial. And so far, no one's telling him what he's been arrested for. They seem very disorganized, and no one seems particularly concerned with him being a flight risk. They're not detaining him. They're not following him around. They don't even necessarily give him dates and times and specific places to turn up for hearings. Everything is very lackadaisical. So he is continuing to go to his job at the bank and continuing to feel very important, because he's a very important man, and continuing to feel that most of the people he interacts with, including all the people involved in this arrest and trial, are beneath him. He is occasionally meeting women who, so far without fail, throw themselves at him. So that's interesting. And honestly, I don't know what to think so far. There's a lot of humor. There's a lot of absurd, over-the-top silliness. It almost reads like a comedy sketch. There's a lot of quips back and forth, and characters who feel like they're sort of winking at the reader, breaking the fourth wall as they make kind of ridiculous comments or assertions. And that's the book so far. I think it's interesting because it's strange. I can't say that I particularly like Joseph K as a person, but I think his characterization is quite vivid, and I'm curious to see where Kafka goes with it. Based on the way the introduction framed it, it almost felt like Joseph K was meant to be based on Kafka himself. And if that's true, then that's a pretty unflattering comparison, in my opinion. But perhaps it's meant to be, an absurd exaggeration. If he's self-aware enough to know a lot of his own flaws, maybe Joseph K is an extreme version of all those things for effect. Perhaps things will sort of land in an interesting way as the book continues that will shift my perspective on Joseph, or at least appreciate the way the book is exploring him and his flaws and foibles. So I think that's all I'm going to say for this update, to be honest. Like I said, it's not really what I expected from Kafka, to be honest, from what I've heard about him. I mean, it is strange, does have that absurdity to it. So far, this just isn't quite what I expected, and that doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means I've heard Kafka-esque used in so many contexts over the course of my life that I had developed an impression of what that meant, and I'm not sure that the trial so far is fitting that, but it is, again, maybe the second half will become more of what I expect it to be when I think of something being Kafkaesque. It does have a very sort of nightmarish quality, a dreamlike quality in the way it's written, and also the fact that everyone is saying and doing absurd things and no one's really explaining anything, and you just kind of pop up in different places at different times in a way that doesn't seem to make any logical sense. The whole justice system feels very dream logic, cobbled together. The office of an important person being just in some random apartment building's attic. The hearing taking place in the back room of this washerwoman's apartment. It definitely reminds me of dreams that I've had where things are happening at completely inappropriate places for no reason, and none of it quite makes sense, but it's just what my brain decided to cobble together that night for my entertainment. So yeah, that's the trial so far. I'm gonna go finish it. I must admit, I am a little bewildered, so I'll see you soon. I finished the trial. You know, I do this thing semi-regularly where I pick up a book that is known to be depressing, to be about and meant to cause existential dread, and then I'm surprised that I feel depressed and a lot of anxiety and existential dread after I read them when I shouldn't be shocked. So that's how I'm feeling about this. I think, my understanding is that that is the intent. So therefore, I guess it was successful. That doesn't necessarily mean that I had fun reading this, although it does have a lot of humor. It is quite funny. It's just very depressing. It's very bleak, and there's a lot of anxiety and dread and hopelessness for Joseph K. and also for us as the reader, watching him go through this nonsensical trial. He's not given any kind of very clear timeline for the proceedings. He gets an advocate only because of his uncle's connections and not through the court system. He isn't automatically given a lawyer or representation. He is finding out bits and pieces, scraps of information from all over the place, and it's very unclear if any of it is accurate or true. And just in general, the system is a mess. It makes no sense, and it's not meant to. And we follow him over the course of a year as he proceeds through this trial and continues to become more and more anxious and paranoid and distracted from his day-to-day life and sucked into the absurdity of this court process. And in reading it, my impression was that, again, this is my first ever experience of Kafka's writing, and I had a vague impression of what his books were like. I had heard the term Kafkaesque enough times, and I knew that his works were a little weird and experimental, but this was an interesting place to start because the trial was not completed by Kafka during his life. He passed before he finished it. He had written several chapters, but hadn't linked them all together, and they weren't in an obvious order. And he had informed, let me know if I got this wrong, but my research tells me that he had informed someone he trusted to burn his unpublished work after his death, which this trusted person did not do, and instead compiled it and published it. So this is the result of Kafka's friend trying to put together the disparate pieces of this writing project into a single story. And you can definitely feel that. The pacing is all over the place. You have chapters that are excruciatingly long. Again, I think that was intentional, very effectively so. They're repetitive and nonsensical and frustrating and unending. And they make you as the reader feel the same way Kay feels, which is effective, but also stressful and frustrating. And then in between those chapters, we sort of jump to other things in a very abrupt way. I especially felt that we went from feeling very in the thick of things to the ending very abruptly. And again, that is explained by the fact that this was unfinished and just sort of cobbled together after Kafka's passing. But it definitely gives you this really jarring stop and go pacing. And it's not the biggest deal at the end of the day, but I do wish that we were able to read whatever the final version of this would have been, because it did feel like we were missing some of those connecting points, a little bit of development, a little bit more exploration of some of these themes. It did feel like something was... Hi, Chewy. It did really feel like something was missing. I wouldn't say it ruined my experience altogether, and obviously you have to go into it with your expectations firmly in check for something that was published posthumously and was unfinished by the author. But I just wanted to note that because it is a bit of it's a stressful reading experience, it's a frustrating reading experience, and it's also very frenetic and chaotic in a variety of ways. I did like it for, like I said, it's very overtly satirical and clearly meant to be very funny. A lot of the dialogue is quickly paced and quips back and forth, and a lot of jokes that are multi-layered, which I appreciated. I did find it quite funny. I was chuckling a lot as I was reading. I did find Kay to be a really interesting protagonist. I didn't like him, but not sure if you were meant to like him, to be totally honest. He is totally convinced of his own innocence, even though he doesn't know what he's been convicted of. And he never once really truly considers that he could have done anything to be arrested for. And yet we watch him over the course of the novel make some questionable decisions. Are they enough to be arrested? That depends, I suppose, on how you interpret them. But he is certainly not a perfect man. And he's definitely an unreliable narrator, and he doesn't see himself particularly clearly. I found his interactions with women pretty hard to stomach, and I was reading that as an intentional point, an intentional flaw in his character, and I certainly hope that that was the case, and it's not just a different time period and a reflection of the author's misogyny. But those interactions were rough, and certainly the genesis of my growing dislike for Kay as a character. But even though I didn't like him as a person, I did find him interesting. I found his story compelling. I found his descent into paranoia and madness on a certain level very interesting to follow. And I found him funny. So I appreciated that. I think, overall, this is, this feels like it's commenting on many different things. The obvious commentary is on the, absurdity of bureaucracy, feeling like you're running through a maze just to get basic things done, especially the kind of bureaucracy that can come along with a more authoritarian or totalitarian government. And that feels very at the forefront, this commentary, and clearly the court system is showing that on many levels. The secrecy and the unspoken rules and the many people you have to go through to find out any even very basic information to make any progress at all. The system is not set up with citizens in mind in any way, shape, or form, and that is the very obvious commentary. But it also felt like a commentary on the absurdity, the nonsensical quality of life in general. Why are we here? What is our purpose? We're all going to die eventually. We never know exactly when or how. And we all either anxiously await that moment or we choose to ignore it, as nonsensical as that may feel, and live the time that we have to its fullest, ignoring the elephant in the room that is our own mortality, and, tying into other existential writers that I have read from, like Albert Camus. I could really feel those themes sort of seeping through all of the pages, and that really added to that sense of hopelessness, helplessness, dread, frustration, anxiety, paranoia, all those things that Kay is feeling as he's spiraling under the weight of this sentence, of this trial. And it does feel, as someone who has suffered from anxiety to different extents at different points in my life, I could very much relate to a lot of the thought patterns he was getting stuck in, and I found it really stressful to read at times. Again, I think that makes it effective, but does it make it an enjoyable reading experience? No. I'm still glad I read it. I think it was worthwhile to read, but it wasn't fun for me personally. There's also a lot of shame in this book. Kay feels a lot of shame. He cares a lot about how people view him, and that ties really well into this idea of a trial where he doesn't know what he's been accused for, and he can't accept the possibility that he could be guilty of something. He can't face the idea of having shame for that. He is very buttoned up and aware of himself and wants to make a good impression on everyone, and also feels superior to everyone, even when he very clearly is not. But he's also very alienated from other people. He has this very distinct disconnect from other human beings. He seems to live a pretty isolated life. And every time he tries to connect with people throughout the book, especially women, he does so in a very unnatural, awkward way. He doesn't feel able to open up to other people and to accept the messiness and the vulnerability that comes from genuinely opening yourself up to another person to let them in, and therefore to give them the power to hurt you. He is not okay with letting go of that control. And yet, this whole trial is an exercise in letting go of control because he doesn't even know what's going on the most basic level. The book reads very much like a nightmare and has that escalating in absurdity and terror quality to it, even as much of it is very mundane. There are just so many moments that make so little sense that it's very unsettling to read. And I can understand why Kafka and why the trial in particular is seen as an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to existential literature and the futility of searching for meaning in a meaningless world. I finished it a few days ago and I had to let myself percolate for a bit because my first thought when I finished it was honestly, I was angry because it made me feel lots of negative feelings and I was very stressed while I was reading it, and I finished it and I just kind of felt mad. But I let myself sit with it for a couple days and I'm glad I did because I am feeling much more positive about the experience now. I appreciate the craft that goes into creating the same feelings in the reader as in the protagonist, and I think it's more effective at exploring its themes for that reason. But again, not necessarily a fun read, and I would caution people to maybe save this for a time when they aren't already grappling with existential dread or your own mortality, because it is quite heavy, even though it's very short and a very quick read. I will do a brief spoiler section for those who have read the trial to kind of wrap this up, and then we'll spin the wheel and find out what I'm going to read next. I hope it's something a little bit lighter, to be totally honest. I did enjoy this. I just need something that doesn't quite hurt my brain so much. So, spoilers for the trial starting now. If you have read the trial, then you know already what a trip this is. And I think what made me most angry when I finished it was the ending, and was the fact that we spend a year with him. He never learns what's going on, which is the point. I know it's the point, but he never finds out what he's accused of. He never makes any real progress, and he's just executed like a dog in the street a year later, and that's it. And again, it's like, that's existential literature. It usually leaves me with this feeling of emptiness and dread and helplessness, which is not a feeling I typically enjoy feeling, to be totally honest. But it's effective, and that's what it's trying to do, so I get it. But it did make me feel a lot of anger because I just got to the end and thought, what was the point of that? And the journey was the point, of course. But also, I've been racking my brain over the last couple days about why the women were written the way they were. I have seen some people who interpret the women as purposefully working against him, that they are agents of the court and they are there to, use his foibles against him to gain information and also to sort of set him on the wrong path, which I'm not sure if I like that or not, if that was the intention, but that is one explanation I saw. Another I saw is that the women are intentionally written the way that they are, and his interactions with them are intentionally uncomfortable, because that is, at the end of the day, what he was actually being accused of. It was tied to mistreatment of or potentially assault of women, that is his main flaw that we see again and again, and that he cannot be normal about women. And we see evidence of that. We see him assaulting a woman at the beginning, kissing her and touching her and groping her without her consent. And he just continues to be weird about women for the whole book. And I think that that's an interesting reading, that is actually what he was being charged with, and that we see the evidence of it again and again. So even though he's not told and we're not told, the subtext is there, it's there on the page. And I can't corroborate this, but someone did say in one of the many Reddit threads that I was skimming, trying to get some ideas for how other people interpret the women in this story, that someone said that is one of the ways that this book is taught in schools in Germany, that his treatment of women is tied to what he was accused of and why he was sentenced to death ultimately. So that's interesting. And I would love to know, if you've read the trial, how you interpreted it. Did you have a theory for what he was accused of? Share it down below. Of course, please write spoilers for the trial at the top of your comment. Hit enter a few times so that we don't spoil anyone else. But I'd be curious to know how you felt about how the women were written, but also if you had any theories or ideas for what he was being accused of, if he was actually accused of anything. Because so much of this is very nonsensical, I wouldn't put it past them to not have any reason at all, to have just randomly chosen him because they wanted to. So I don't know if I have more spoilers, to be honest. Not that much happens in this book. I mean, stuff happens, but not a lot. So I think that's it. Those are my spoilers for the trial. Those are my thoughts on the trial. I'm glad I gave myself a few more days to process, but I'm definitely still feeling a little discombobulated by the whole experience. Right now, I'm sitting at 4 stars for this. I'm not sure I could quite give it 5, especially because it's incomplete and because of how bad it made me feel while I was reading it, even though I know that's intentional. I'm just not quite sure that I would be being totally honest with myself and with you if I said it was a 5-star read, but it is a very solid 4, and I do think it's doing a lot of things very well. So that's the trial. Wow, what an experience. I'm going to spin the wheel and find out what I'm going to read next. And please, to the universe, may it be something much less taxing on my brain. Down this road, I reminisce. I go slow, I let go now. Oh man, this goes down. Dun, 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 dun. Go ahead and say it. Somebody loved me once, and somebody will again, like the way you loved me on Nightingale Lane. Okay, spinning the wheel again. Please, oh please, to the universe, let it be something that doesn't break my brain. I need a light read right now. What is it? The Pillars of the Earth. Wow, you can't write this shit. You can't plan it. It just happens. Okay, let me find it. Damn it. So the wheel landed on The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett because the universe has a sense of humor. This is an almost 1,000-page historical fiction novel about building a church. So this is a paperback and it's heavy enough that it would knock you out if someone hit you over the head with it. Like, just perfect. Amazing. I bought it because it sounded interesting. I've heard many good things about it. I have also heard people say that it is a total slog and a waste of time and tedious as all hell. I certainly hope that that is not my experience of it, but I am a little concerned because I have heard that, and this is almost 1,000 pages. But I bought it and I'm gonna give it a go because the wheel landed on it, so I have to. So that's how it works. So I'm gonna go start this. I better start immediately because 2 weeks is not a lot of time to read this, especially as I'm reading lots of other things simultaneously. So I'm gonna go do that. I'll be back when I get 500 pages in, roughly, to let you know how it's going, unless I end up DNFing, in which case I'll probably be here sooner. Either way, wish me luck. All right, I'm halfway through The Pillars of the Earth. I honestly thought this would take more time and effort than it has. This is a much easier read than I expected, not nearly as dense as I thought it would be. The language is pretty simple and straightforward. It's very readable. There's always something happening. We're always switching between different points of view. There are often cliffhangers happening. So it's actually a pretty easy read, and I feel like I'm kind of flying through it. So there's that. I'm also enjoying it on the level of liking a few of the characters, mostly Philip. Philip is the MVP so far. He's the prior, and I like him a lot. I'm finding following his journey is quite interesting. There are a couple other characters who I like Aliana, but Philip is definitely my favorite. And the story of Philip trying to fix the finances and build a cathedral as prior is the most interesting part of this book for me. And honestly, as I'm reading it, I just find myself wishing that that was the entire book. I mean, it is most of the book, but I just feel like maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm reading intention where it isn't there, but it feels like the author thought that that would be too boring for people. And so he's inserting wars, battles, really mean supervillain, cartoonishly evil lords that go around intimidating and killing and raping and torturing people. And it's just like, sure, probably realistic for the Middle Ages. I don't really want to read it though. I kind of want to just read about building the cathedral and managing the money and helping get the monks in order and, strengthening the community in the town. Maybe that makes me boring. Maybe I am boring. I don't know. I just like the parts where they talk about the design of the cathedral and the processes and people working together at the quarry or to try to finish the foundation in time to show it to the potential future archbishop so that they can continue to build it and trying to find funding and supplies. I don't know. That's the part that I like. Working together and building stuff. I just don't love the way that some of the other content is being handled. And again, it's probably realistic for the time period. I'm not saying that the brutality and the wealth and gender inequality are unrealistic, because they are historically accurate. I just don't want to read in great detail a teenager being sexually assaulted. I don't want to read about our cartoonishly evil villain tossing a young woman's baby in the air and then assaulting her in front of her father and the entire town. Some of the assaults are not told in as much detail, but some of them are relatively graphic on the page in a way that feels like it's leaning into the shock value of it all, or maybe even I don't want to read intention into why the author wrote it that way. I don't want to be unfair in my interpretation, but it does feel a little bit like fetishizing it because it's written in so much detail. And it is written from the perspective of someone who does have this like fetish for hurting people and taking people against their will. And yes, he's a villain, but we already know we don't need to be in his head as he assaults someone to know that he's a terrible person. It's been established many, many times against humans and non-human animals. We know he's terrible. I just don't personally appreciate reading that kind of content if it doesn't feel absolutely vital to the story that's being told. And even then, I don't appreciate when it's told in a way that feels sort of voyeuristic. And it kind of does here. Your mileage may vary. You may read it differently. I'm not claiming it's not realistic for the time. I just don't appreciate reading it, and I don't appreciate the tone with which it's being told to me. So there's that. The women are not terribly written. I was warned by a few people in the comments when I landed on this book that I might hate how the women are written. And so far, I don't actually mind how the women are characterized. I think a lot of the women in this story so far have been some of the smartest, most strategic, most capable, and resilient and strong-willed characters and morally good characters, and they are complex. That being said, the women seem to only either be allowed to be very young and beautiful and described as sexually appealing and objectified by the men around them, or absolutely horrifying, horrific, repulsive, and nothing in between. The only women who are allowed to exist in between are very quickly written out of the story, either by being killed off or they just disappear. So I don't know how to feel about that. It feels like the women are allowed to be three-dimensional, complex, interesting characters and put in these positions of leadership or respect from the people around them, but they also have to be sexualized at the same time, the vast majority of them. And not a super fan of that. I also am annoyed because I really liked the character of Tom Builder, who is the mason who was building this cathedral at the beginning. I found him, flawed for sure, but I liked him. I thought he seemed like a realistic person. He seemed very passionate about his career, his craft. I was rooting for him to get to build his cathedral. And then Follett just decided to completely assassinate his character very early on, and then never apologized for it whatsoever, never tried to redeem it, in a way that also kind of makes no sense. That again involved sexualizing an inexplicably hot character who just popped up out of nowhere to be sexy. I'll do a very brief spoiler section to talk about that, but if you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. What was that about? And it's making me really struggle to like Tom, even though he is a fine character otherwise. And honestly, what really gets to me is that I feel like that choice actually doesn't fit with his character at all. At least the character as he has been described in every other way doesn't fit this choice. And it just feels like a weird thing that the author wanted to write for some reason. The timing is completely off. The tone of it was completely off. I just don't like how Follett deals with sex, whether it's consensual or not. I don't think it's handled very well, and it's kind of ruining some of these characters for me, which is too bad because I like the characters otherwise, and I like the story generally otherwise. Again, not a fan of our villain. Clearly not supposed to be a fan. I wish he was on the page less because I just hate him, which you're supposed to, but I would rather spend more time with the other characters, to be honest. He could show up occasionally being evil, and I would still hate him just as much, but I wouldn't be as annoyed having to be in his head so often when he's just a disgusting worm. So anyway, those are my thoughts so far. I did at 2 points consider DNFing, both because of sexual content, once consensual but completely nonsensical, and once non-consensual and unnecessarily explicit. I decided to continue despite that, and so far I'm not sure if it's going to pay off and if it's going to feel worth it in the end. And I'm still wishing that this was just the story of Philip working on his cathedral with none of the other stuff, to be honest. It kind of sucks that Philip exists in this story because he's great and there's so much not great around him. And there doesn't have to be. Why? Anyway, those are my thoughts for the first half. I'm going to stop. There. I will do a brief spoiler section to specify what I'm talking about, though I'm pretty sure you'll know what I mean if you've read this, and then I'm going to go finish it, and we'll just find out what happens. We'll see if it's worth it at the end of the day after 1,000 pages. So, spoilers now for the first half of The Pillars of the Earth. That's I read up to page 488. Okay, spoilers starting now. So basically, again, if you've read this, you know what I'm talking about. Tom and his family are in the woods. He can't get work. They're wandering around. His wife is pregnant. They have 2 kids. She goes into labor. She gives birth. It's the middle of the winter. They're out in the wilderness, and she has a lot of bleeding, and she ends up passing away in the hours after birth. And the baby is okay, but she has died, and Tom is grieving and, totally distraught and sort of out of sorts. And he feels like there's no way to care for the baby. There's no way to bring the baby with them. The baby is just going to die without mother's milk. They don't really even have food for the rest of them to survive on. So he and his kids bury his wife and their mother and leave the baby on top of the grave to go with her, essentially, and just leave this infant in the wilderness. That was hard enough to read, although perhaps, again, realistic for the time period. But then they're on their way leaving, and Tom increasingly is feeling like he did the wrong thing and he should go back for the baby. So he finally goes back for the baby. I'm telling this whole thing, if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, he goes back for the baby isn't there. And then he runs into inexplicably hot woods lady, Ellen, and her son. And in like a dreamlike, grief-stricken state, I think this is still the same day that his wife died, they have sex. And she admits that she fell in love with him at first sight when they ran into each other in the woods in the fall or whenever it was. They just decide to be a couple. Now, again, not even a day since his wife died in his arms in childbirth or just after childbirth due to complications. And he's already sleeping with another woman and not confessing his love to her, but accepting her love confession with not a lot of pushback. What in the world am I reading? Why would you write that? Why? What is wrong with you? Ken Follett, truly, what possessed you to write this? It makes sense that he, as a distraught, grief-stricken person, I mean, obviously not everyone would make that choice, and I can't imagine making that choice, but still, I could understand. It could be argued that he would, in his grief-stricken state, turn to the next available woman and transfer his emotions onto her and want to have support and another adult who can help take care of their kids and face this together and have love and care and compassion from another adult as he's dealing with the loss of his soulmate. Sure. Starting with having sex before they even have a conversation and diving into this hours after his wife's death and him like really enjoying himself and then never addressing it. He talks about missing his wife. He talks about talking to her all the time because they knew each other so well, but he never once seems to feel any guilt whatsoever about his choices, and he also seems to be wholeheartedly in love with Ellen now and wants to marry her and live with her forever, and is constantly thinking about how sexy she is and how much better in bed she is than his deceased wife. Like, what? Follett, what is wrong with you? Truly wild. Because I was liking Tom, but what the fuck? So there's that. And that happened pretty early on, and I almost put down the book for good because I was like, what am I reading right now? I'm sorry, what? Anyway, so there's that. Still not over it. It's been hundreds of pages. I'm still mad. Still don't understand the choice. And then, of course, we get multiple scenes, pretty graphic, like not as explicit as they could be, I guess, but pretty explicit descriptions of William, our villain, sexually assaulting women. So we get that in detail of a character whose point of view we follow at times. We get to follow her for chapters after as she deals with the mental trauma and also the physical injuries of the assault. But she is assaulted by two men in front of her little brother who they forced to watch. And we are told that in much more graphic detail than we needed. And it felt very voyeuristic and gross. And it could have been implied if it really had to happen at all, which I don't think it had to, honestly. I think sexual assault is thrown into stories all the time. And the argument, especially in historical fiction, is, well, it's realistic for the time. I don't care. Does it actually add anything to your story? No? Then don't add it. Didn't need to be there. I don't think we needed any sexual assault in this book at all. But even if we did need it, apparently, or it was put in there, it didn't have to be explicit. And then we get him explicitly sexually assaulting a sex worker on the page. Again, explicitly described, multiple people assaulting, people watching, in the head of the person assaulting who is getting off on violence and fear. Why? Why? And then it's implied that it happens many more times. At least one of the times it's like a fade to black situation where it cuts away before anything happens. The sex in this book feels so gross. And of course you could argue that some of it is meant to feel gross, but it also feels like, again, I don't want to read into Ken Follett's intentions, but I would not doubt that there are people reading this who find those scenes erotic. And I think that that is fucked up. I personally, for myself, never want to read explicit scenes of assault. Ever. It's something that I have never felt adds to a book I'm reading. And in this case, I very much feel that. I don't understand why. Obviously, William is supposed to be the worst, and he is the worst, so fine. He was already the worst. We didn't need these scenes to know that he was the worst, and to want people to get revenge on him. And the book is fine otherwise, but the sex is weird. All of the sex, in every instance, didn't need to be here. And I don't think I'm a prude. I'm fine with explicit sex in the books I read. I recently read The Everlasting by Alex E. Harrow, which has explicit sex in it, and I thought it was great. 5 stars. Amazing book. The sex added to the book. I think it was great. It was very explicit. It was fine. No. In this book, no. Okay. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I'm going to stop now. That is the end of spoilers. Those are my thoughts on the first half of The Pillars of the Earth. I honestly don't know what to think still. I really wish this was just the story of Philip and his cathedral, and I'm sad that it's not that. And again, maybe that makes me boring, but I don't care. That's how I feel. So that's it. I'm going to go finish it, I guess. And I'll come back when I'm done and we'll see if it was worth it in the end. Goodbye. So I finished The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. I actually finished it about a week ago. I have needed to take time to process this. I actually read it in a few days. It really didn't take me very long to actually read it, to get through it. But then I just had to sit with it for a while because I could not get my thoughts in order and I could not decide how I felt about it at the end of the day. Honestly, I had very, very mixed feelings and I still have mixed feelings, but I realized that I had to suck it up and review it. I had to just talk about it. I couldn't just continue to go back and forth in my brain and have arguments with myself about it for weeks and weeks and weeks. So here we are. I'm going to try to go through my feelings and my experience in a non-spoiler way first, and then I'll get into spoilers. A number of the things that I need to complain about or that I didn't like in here involve spoilers to some degree, but I will try to talk about them in very vague terms first for anyone who hasn't read this yet, because I do want to try to be explicit about my issues with this book, especially for those who are thinking about picking it up. So I have tried to organize my thoughts. I have a lot of notes here, so I'm going to refer to them because I didn't want to get stuck in the weeds. This is a very long book. A lot of stuff happens. I could talk about it for hours and hours and hours and still have more to say, probably, just because so much happens. There's so many characters, but I'm trying to keep it a little bit more concise here. So my overall experience with this book was very mixed. I felt like it had a number of very strong elements, and there were many moments that I enjoyed it, that I found it interesting, that I found it engaging. There were some characters I really liked, especially Philip was probably my favorite character. I really liked the cathedral building. I'm sure a lot of people will find those passages very boring. I loved them. Those were probably my favorite parts of this book. Learning about Philip's experience as a prior, trying to run a monastery and being the leader of all these monks and how that works was really interesting to me. How they interacted with the local villages and with the sort of government, the monarchy at the time, and how those systems worked. Fascinating. Learning more about how society and these systems worked in the time period. So interesting. And cathedral building. And all the architecture of it all, and the physics of building these incredible works of art. Loved that because I'm a nerd and very boring, I guess. I will admit the scope is very ambitious. This covers many characters. It covers a pretty long period of time, and it gets really into the weeds with the architecture, which I think for those who enjoy it, like myself, that's fantastic. But I have also seen reviews from people who found those passages exceedingly tedious to get through. So I think your mileage may vary. I have always been interested in architecture. I did for a while consider going to school to become an architect. So I really liked those passages, but not everyone is going to love them. Like I said, some of the characters really stood out to me. Philip was my favorite by far. I felt he was the best character in terms of development by far. Jack is probably a close second. And then Aliana, I really wanted to be invested in her, and I was at times. I do think she is the best written female character in this book. Not to tip my hand, but unfortunately that's not saying much in this book. She had a lot more to do than the other female characters, and I did like some aspects of her character development. I do think other aspects were very underdeveloped and occasionally nonsensical. So I had varying degrees of investment in her as the book went on, depending on how Follett was writing her at various points in her life. I will also say it was very easy to read, which a few people told me. They said, I know it looks massive. It's actually a very easy read. You'll get through it very quickly. That was definitely true. I think that's both a pro and con in that the writing is very simple and also can be very repetitive, not in a plot being repetitive kind of way, because a lot happens in this. Even though it's long, it's really packed with stuff happening. More so in the fact that I think Ken Follett may be worried that because of the length that people might take breaks and read it over a long period of time. So semi-regularly when we're meeting up with a character we haven't seen for a while, we just get a little recap of everything we've seen of them in the book so far. And they were usually confined to a few sentences. So it's not like it went on for ages, maybe occasionally a paragraph or two, but it was annoying. I was there when that happened the first time. You don't have to tell me like I wasn't there. You already wrote that. Anyway, probably that issue was exacerbated by the fact that I read this in maybe 3 days. So I don't need the recaps. I could go back and reread a section if I forgot or look at my notes or something, but I also just remember because I just read it. Anyway, the style of the writing is a bit of a pro and a con in that it is very easy to read. It's very simplistic, but it is also at times lacking in a little bit of that lyrical or atmospheric quality that I sometimes look for, especially in historical fiction. I think that there is an opportunity to get a little more flowery with the language, and I can be a fan of that. And here it was very, very straightforward and simplistic, but it is what it is. On to my main critique of this book, and I'm going to rest this on my knee because goddamn, this book is heavy. I really disliked how women were written in this book. And some of you warned me that Ken Follett was 100% a man writing women. You know, I heard you, but I also sort of expected it to be, I don't know, more so portraying women as they would have been seen at the time, which is the case here, but also just, I don't know, maybe having fewer female characters and not really diving into their interiority as much as the male characters, which also happened here. What I was not expecting was repeated again and again and again and again objectification of women, and also repeated again and again and again and again graphic on-page sexual assaults that, while on the one hand were clearly written to depict the character doing the assaulting as an evil villain and written to be traumatizing and upsetting, also spent too much time for my comfort focused on the bodies of the victims, on the sexual appeal, on what it felt like in a sexually gratifying way. Almost all of those scenes were written from the perspective of the assaulter. And so we were in their head as they're enjoying themselves and enjoying it more so because they are causing fear and pain. We get descriptions of parts of bodies jiggling, and it's too much for me. The framing of it was really uncomfortable. I have seen people defend these scenes saying they're meant to be uncomfortable. I have seen people defend them by saying that, sexual assault was a part of life at the time. I think that those can be true. And I also think that at the same time, there can be nuance, and that the objectification of women's bodies while in those scenes and continually repeating them with the level of graphic detail that is in this book, and also that they are almost always told from the perspective of the person who is enjoying it, can be crossing a line. And for me personally, it crossed the line out of realistic portrayal to something much more distasteful. I don't feel that this book does enough to reckon with the trauma of these assaults. It tries to do it with one of the characters, and it is something that comes up again and again for that character and impacts her life. But I don't feel that it was ever explored to the depth that it should have been, considering how much narrative weight these assaults had in the book. I think that there is perhaps a gap in Ken Follett's ability to understand that experience, or maybe a lack of research, but it felt very shallow to me. And as a reader, I never particularly appreciate reading sexual assaults. I especially don't particularly enjoy reading them when they are told in graphic detail, especially repeatedly. And especially when it feels like the act itself is being sexualized by the text. Now, I'm not accusing Ken Follett of anything in terms of his own life and interests. What I am saying is that I didn't personally appreciate the way that he wrote those scenes. I don't think they were well done. They didn't feel respectful. It felt like the text was lingering on and reveling in the acts themselves. And to me, not only was that unnecessary, but it felt like a continuation of my issue with how women were written in general in this book. They felt underutilized, they felt sidelined, they felt very one-dimensional for the most part. Again, the exception is Aliana. There was an attempt to give her more characterization. She was more involved in the story, but I do think several aspects of her character were very underdeveloped in comparison to the male characters on the page, and every other female character basically got no development. The differences were pretty stark in comparison. You have this generation of kids, Jack, Albert, and Martha, and both Jack and Albert are heavily on the page. Even though Jack is the only one who actually becomes a protagonist, Albert also gets a huge amount of page time. A lot of development, is really involved in everything. Martha is there the whole time, and she is barely on the page. She's barely mentioned. We even have Jack at one point thinking at length about how odd it is that Martha just stuck around and never did her own thing and never had a life of her own, never went off to get married, has just hung out with him and taken care of him and is always around. And he thinks, I wonder why she does that. Does he ask her? No, he has no interest in knowing the answer. He just thinks it's weird. We never get an answer. She's there the whole time, but no development. Jack's mother, Ellen, makes some weird decisions very early on, which I'm sure I talked about at the halfway point, and they're never explained sufficiently for me. They're explained by, sometimes you just know, and love at first sight is 100% a thing. Like, okay, it doesn't really make sense for her characterization at all. She also basically disappears in the second half of the book. She is a much more minor character in the story than I expected. She does not get the development you would expect. And of course, the man she's paired with is a protagonist and is very involved in the story, much more on the page, but Ellen herself is not. Even the next generation, there is a boy and a girl, and the boy is repeatedly referred to as being much more intelligent than the girl. It's just constant. It's constant. And the villain of this story is shown sexually assaulting several characters, including minors. And again, at the time, the consideration of when a woman was an adult was very different, but still on-page graphic assault of multiple characters, multiple minors, and also of sex workers. And I think what bothers me the most is that, again, the lead up to these scenes, there's one scene where things are interrupted, but in the lead up to it, as he is preparing to assault this woman, her body is described in such a sexualized, objectifying way, and it's sort of reveling in the fact that she is curvier and describing her curves and the way she looks as she's terrified, and it just really makes me very uncomfortable. And not in a I'm too sensitive to read books or historical fiction kind of way, not in a oh no, I can't read books that make me uncomfortable kind of way. I read horror all the time. I read lots of stuff that is uncomfortable and is meant to be, and it's fine. I think there's a difference between writing something with respect and care and intention and trying to depict it in a non-sexualized way out of respect for victims of this kind of crime. And it is another thing to revel in the shock and try to make it more sexy, in my personal opinion. I know a lot of people love this book. I have seen people get torn to shreds by fans of this book when they bring up not being a huge fan of how women are written and how those scenes are written. I mean, I'm used to having unpopular opinions about books. I'm used to people piling on me and telling me I can't read or I'm stupid or I'm too sensitive or too woke or whatever. I don't care. Genuinely, I don't care. It doesn't bother me. I also just am honest about my opinions when I read books, and that is my opinion. And you're allowed to like the book anyway. If you do, you're also allowed to not see the scenes the same way I do or not to have reacted the same way I did. But for me, it was incessant. I felt it came up far too many times, and I felt the scenes were far too explicit, and the framing did not sit well with me at all. What adds to this feeling is that women are constantly sexualized and objectified for their bodies through the whole book, and often are self-objectifying. I couldn't count the number of scenes where characters are thinking about their own breasts, the size of their breasts, how perky or saggy they are, thinking about how they feel about it, how other people might feel about it, and then also many descriptions from other characters thinking about or describing other women, usually the women's breasts. And again, if it wasn't such an incessant pattern, I would be less likely to dwell on it, but it is an incessant pattern. And ultimately what this did is it made me feel alienated as a reader. It felt like this was a book written by a man aimed at men, and that he never really considered or thought twice about how women might feel reading this book. Now, again, I know there are women who love this book. I've seen women say that they loved Eliana, they thought she was really well written, that they thought she had agency and was strong and powerful and smart, and she is those things. Again, I do think there are aspects of her characterization that were not as well handled or not handled with as much attention and care as the male characters. But I will say she stood out as the best written female character. I'm not saying that if you are a woman, you have to agree with my take on this, but I will say that me, as a woman reading this, I felt like I was in a space that wasn't meant for me. And it was alienating as a reader. Every time I started getting into the swing of things, I'd be reading a long passage about the architecture, or I'd be reading a passage with Philip, and we would switch to a different point of view, and suddenly a woman would be having her breasts described, or we'd be reading yet another sexual assault scene. And I just was taken out of it again and reminded once again that this book did not care about my experience reading it, or that's how it felt. Once again, I'm not questioning the fact that women being treated differently or being sexualized or being assaulted would be accurate for the time period. I realize women were very much lacking in rights and agency at the time. I do think that considering the realities of the time, characters like Eliana are given much more agency than they actually would have had, and I do appreciate that. That being said, historical accuracy is not a blanket excuse to write characters in an objectifying or offensive way. This book was not written in the Middle Ages, and therefore my expectations are higher of it, even if it is trying to be accurate. It can also be respectful in its portrayal, in my opinion. But those are my non-spoilery thoughts on the Pillars of the Earth, and I'd really be interested in hearing your thoughts down below. Now I'm going to get into spoilers. So these are spoilers for the entire book. If you've not read The Pillars of the Earth and you have any plans to skip these spoilers, but we're getting into spoilers now. Just a few more specific examples about how these women are written and how underdeveloped I feel most of them are. For example, right near the start, and I'm sure I talked about this in the halfway update, we get Tom, who is described to be very in love with his wife, Agatha. Yes, she's, very plain, not the most beautiful, but she's a great wife and they love each other. It establishes that they really love each other. And then Agatha dies in childbirth, and Tom, within hours, is having sex with this stranger in the woods who he's seen one other time. And the explanation is non-existent. The explanation is he was grieving. Okay. Again, not really an explanation, in my opinion. Wild to have just had your wife die in your arms after giving birth in the woods and having to bury her body and then abandoning your infant son because you feel like you can't take care of him. And then a few hours later, before you've even found shelter, before you've even focused on making sure your kids are safe, having sex with a random woman in the woods. But anyway, not only is it not explained from Tom's point of view, but also Ellen's reasoning is never explained. For almost the entire book, I thought that it was going to be revealed that Ellen was actually a witch or had some sort of ulterior motive and was trying to use Tom for that, and that's why she slept with him in that instance. But the reasoning was literally just that she fell in love with him at first sight and wanted to have sex with him. That's it. Pardon? Even if you did fall in love with him at first sight, which why? What? Okay, fine. Why would you try to have sex with a man who just watched his wife die, who just held his wife as she died? Are you kidding me? Ridiculous. Anyway, so we get that moment. Never explained. I liked Tom at the start, even though he was clearly a flawed character. I struggled to like him or care about him for the rest of the book after that point, because truly, what the fuck? Ellen, also, she had the most patchy, strange characterization for me the whole time. I could not understand what her motivations were or what she actually felt about anything. We got very little interiority for her. And like I said, in the second half, she just disappears for most of the book. Such a missed opportunity. She was such an interesting character. And then she just continued to make choices that made no sense and then was written out of the story. Once her husband died, she was no longer relevant to the plot. So goodbye. Then we get Aliana. She's the only one, she's the only female character with a major arc, and she does have more agency. She does have, intelligence on the page. She is very independent, but also I find that her emotions were not explored very deeply and felt very repetitive. She had the same beats again and again. She thought about the same things again and again, and she had very little growth and change emotionally. I will say the one moment that I really appreciated for her was when her brother finally regained the earlhood and she had this angry outburst yelling at her dead father, essentially blaming him for basically sidetracking her entire life, making her entire life about protecting her brother and putting her brother back in his rightful place, forcing her to sacrifice her life for her father's legacy and for her brother, and to not be able to prioritize herself and her own needs and wants. And I really appreciated that because I was waiting for her to have that realization or to express that. But there were just so many other aspects of her characterization to do with her lingering trauma from being assaulted, to do with her complicated feelings about her brother, to do with her relationship with Jack and the complications there, to do with her marriage to Albert. There were just so many aspects of her emotional life that I felt, again, if they were explored on the page, it would be sort of the same thoughts and feelings just repeated again and again. And I felt like we got a lot more complexity and exploration of the emotional lives of the male characters, which proves to me that Ken Follett has the capability of doing so. It just felt like there was less of an effort with Aliana, even though she was by far the most deeply explored female character. Then, like I mentioned, Martha is totally shafted in this book. We get so much more detail about Jack and Alfred. Again, Alfred's not even one of the main characters, but he comes back again and again. We get a lot more detail about his experience. He's featured in more subplots. But even though Martha is also always there, and we occasionally get little quips in dialogue of her chiming in that she also had an experience with whatever they're talking about, her experiences are barely ever on the page. And like I said, we even get a moment from Jack for several paragraphs wondering why she stuck around and wondering about her motivations and not living a life of her own. But again, he never asks her. We never find out. She's not a point of view character. She doesn't matter. And then the fourth child from this family, which is the baby that was abandoned and then was raised by the monastery, Jonathan, also gets way more development. So this is a family of four, 3 boys and a girl, and the boys all have way more page time, way more importance to the plot, way more development. Even though Jonathan and Alfred have less page time than Jack, they still get much more richness to their characterization. And Martha, I could not tell you anything about her other than the fact that she really likes Jack and therefore has spent her whole life taking care of him, basically. Again, we don't know why either. We never find out. Even extending to some of the larger political machinations in this book, we've also followed the monarchs in this story, which I did feel was a little bit, there is quite a bit of scope here, and I found it interesting. I do think that a lot of what was happening with the monarchs could have been cut. It really wasn't as relevant to your everyday regular people, and they tried to make those connections more direct, and that's fine. I just didn't really care, to be honest, about who was in charge. I didn't care who the king or queen was. But that being said, when Stephen is king, we get quite a bit of time with him. We get Stephen on page having pretty drawn out conversations with people. We have our protagonist, Philip, meeting Stephen and having interactions with him. We learn much more about Stephen. He gets a lot more development as a character and more page time, but his rival, Maud, barely on the page. Barely any development. She is politically powerful. She is a strong woman. She starts the civil war, essentially. She fights for her right to be on the throne. She would be such an interesting character to follow, but she gets way less focus than Stephen does, and even less focus than Henry, who shows up much later in the story, but he feels like he gets more page time and more detailed descriptions. Feels like he's more of a focus than Maud, which again, just why? I'll also say that I felt William was a pretty flat villain. He does get some development. We learn things like his fears. He's terrified of hell. We learn that he has a complicated relationship with his mother, could be described as an abusive relationship with his mother. He's afraid of her. We know that he is very easily embarrassed, that he's afraid of being embarrassed or laughed at, that he searches for control and power and admiration. We learn a lot about him and his motivations. He is a complex character on that front, but he also is deeply repetitive. Those things we learn about him are stated again and again and again and again. He gets way more chapters than I think he needed. I would have loved to have more narrative focus on some of the other characters, in part because he's just a terrible person, which he's supposed to be, but I don't need to read about him being horrific over and over and over again to know he's horrific. A few chapters would have been enough. Even, half the amount of chapters that William got would have been enough for me to know that he's terrible, to understand he's terrible. I didn't find him very interesting, and I also, for obvious reasons, did not enjoy reading his chapters. And even more so, every time a William chapter started, I started to tense up, wondering if we were going to have another explicit sexual assault scene, and many, many times we did. And again, it felt quite unnecessary. I also felt like the way that his arc ended, the fact that he dies a very quick and sudden death, was unsatisfying to me. I feel like after all the pain and suffering we had to watch, in real time from his perspective, I would have loved a little bit of torturing, to be honest. I think he deserved a slow, painful death, actually. And honestly, even that probably wouldn't have been satisfying because we were forced to experience so much of his cruelty firsthand, but it would have been better than what we got. It felt like it was not nearly enough for me to make up for how much time we had to spend in his head. There wasn't a proper revenge story. We didn't even get to have Aliana be the one to kill him. I wanted her to stab him like 7,000 times so he could die slowly. But we didn't get that. I really do think that I would have ended up giving this a higher rating if not for the repeated sexual assault scenes that felt very voyeuristic and made me feel quite gross for witnessing them. Because at the end of the day, I think this has a lot to give, and I understand why a lot of people love it. I loved many aspects of it. But unfortunately, those scenes and the way women were written persistently through this entire story just really detracted from my experience. And as much as I'd love to be able to, I don't know if I'd love to be able to, I think that maybe at a different time in my life, I would have tried to ignore that and just focus on what I loved about it. But I just can't. I really hate to read about women being depicted this way, and it kind of ruined my experience, to be honest. And as much as I review books publicly and I try to be very detailed so that it can hopefully help those of you out there watching know if a book will be to your taste or not, my ratings at the end of the day are just my personal ratings for how I felt about a book and my experience. And for me personally, as much as I love so many parts of this, and it kind of pains me to give it such a low rating. For me, this was a 2-star read at the end of the day. And that sucks because it had potential to be incredible. There are aspects of it that are really great, but there were so many parts of this that were painful to read, and they didn't have to be that way. That it makes it even worse that I feel like it would be so easy to avoid writing those scenes that way, writing that many, or writing them in so much detail, and also so easy to avoid writing female characters that way. So yeah, that's that. Now, for my next spin, in part because I took a whole other week to just argue with myself about how I was going to talk about this and how I felt about it and how I was going to review it, I feel like I'm getting behind on this challenge. I feel like I have been taking extra time with several books. I just feel in general like I'm making very slow progress. And even though I'm having a really good time, most of the books I've read for this challenge since the beginning have been 4 or 5-star reads. I've had a few misses, but not nearly as many as new favorites. And I have been making progress, and it's been going well. But I do also feel like the progress has been slow. So I kind of thought I'd do something fun. Instead of spinning the wheel and picking an individual book to read in the next 2 weeks, I thought I'd do something a little different and introduce a fun new aspect to this challenge. I had to put this down. It's so heavy. Oh my God. Ow. I'm gonna get carpal tunnel solely from reading and reviewing The Pillars of the Earth. But I'm really excited about introducing a fun new aspect to this challenge, which is going to be Read It or Unhaul It sprints. And the basic premise is that I'm going to pick and read a book from my physical TBR every day for a week so I can make some rapid progress and really catch up, sprints. I'm going to try it and see how it goes. Here's how it's going to work, okay? Every day for a week, I'm going to spin my raffle tickets to randomly select one. And like I said, every ticket has a prompt on it, but also all the colors of the tickets correspond to a genre because I'm extra like that. I'll put the colors of the tickets and their corresponding genres on the screen. So when I pick a ticket, my aim is to try to find a book on my physical TBR that both matches the genre and the prompt, that also ideally is short enough that I could actually read it in a single day. But I also have options. So if I can't find something that fits both, I can just go for one or the other. So I can just pick something that fits the prompt, but maybe it's a different genre than the color of the ticket. Or I could pick something from the genre that the color represents that isn't maybe quite right for the prompt, depending. So every day for a week, I'm going to spin this. I'm going to pick a random ticket. I'm going to find a book that fits it, and I'm going to read it in 24 hours and come back the next day to review it and pick a new ticket. And I'm going to do that for a whole week starting today so I can catch up on this challenge. I'm so excited. Like I said, I really wanted to do something a little different to make it exciting for myself, so I'm not just spinning a wheel again. So I hope you're excited too. Yes, it's extra, but again, it's the little things in life that bring us joy. Sometimes we just have to indulge our inner child, and this is indulging my inner child to the nth degree, and I'm very excited about it.